We have only been able to bring this involving the Evergreen State, but I would hope that all of my colleagues would join me in saying that before this gets forced on the citizens of Washington State, we adopt some reasonable measures, and I'll retain the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska rise?
Mr. Chairman, in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the acting for the Natural Resources Committee Chairman, Doc Hastings of Washington State, I oppose this amendment. As explained in the debate on the prior two amendments, this bill is focused on increasing American-made energy, creating new jobs, and decreasing our dependency on energy from foreign nations. Congress needs to focus on increasing energy production, and this amendment goes to the opposite direction. In fact, this amendment attempts to impose unprecedented and impossible obstacles to fostering more American energy in federal waters. It is stated that the purpose of the amendment is to give the state of Washington a say on leasing in federal waters off the state's coast. However, multiple federal laws already provide Washington State and every state the opportunity to participate in any such decisions. What this amendment would do is grant double veto power for Washington State and prohibit federal activities in federal waters outside the state borders. The Interior Department provides repeated opportunities for public comment and participation about planning and leasing process. Furthermore, the Coastal Zone Management Act requires state consistency review with the State Coastal Zone Management Plan before the federal government takes action in federal waters off any particular state. On top of that, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act provides clear requirements for the consultation and cooperation with affected state and local governments. Considerable care and protection is provided to each and every state with extra consideration guaranteed to coastal states. This is as it should be. What is particularly revealing about this amendment that it only gives Washington State double veto power over certain types of offshore energy leasing. It singles out only oil and natural gas, but provides no such veto power over other forms of energy leasing. This includes wave energy, wind, solar, and other renewable forms. This double standard exposes the real intent of this amendment. It's not truly aimed at ensuring a voice for Washington State. It's intended to score political points. But the political points of the amendment attempts to score an entirely hollow. Why? Because it isn't estimated to be any recoverable oil or natural gas on federal waters off of Washington State. Again, this bill only goes into areas that have really large potential. Again, multiple federal laws already guarantee all Americans have an opportunity to participate in offshore planning process, especially the governors, state and local officials and citizens living in coastal states that will be impacted by leasing should it take place. And for those reasons, I urge members to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska reserves. The gentleman from Washington has 45 seconds remaining and is recognized.
Thank you. First, I wish my friend Doc Hastings from Washington is with us today. He's not feeling well, but Mr. Young is doing an admirable job with a weak argument, and I'll report that they're getting represented. I just want to point out, we haven't seen horrendous damage to any ecosystem from a wind spill yet. If you spill a little wind, you don't end up covering large Gulf areas with hydrocarbons or destroying oyster and shrimping grounds like having in the Gulf. There are differences from multiple sources. We are simply saying that before we move forward with additional offshore drilling, we ought to have reasonable safety protocols, we ought to address speculation, and we ought to have an energy policy that looks at all the above. You know, my friends across the aisle told us you were going to give us an all-the-above energy policy. All you've given us is an all-the-below energy policy. We need a little better in this. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Alaska has 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And is recognized.
My good friend from Washington, they may not have a wind spill, but there's opposition to wind power. And wind is extremely expensive and only can be successful as long as it's subsidized by the taxpayer. And as long as this administration keeps insisting on wind and solar power, they're doubly taxing our taxpayers of this nation and hurting our economy. That's reality. That's reality. So they're doubly taxed because now they're paying taxes because of the high cost of oil, the high cost of gasoline, $1,100 a year They're additionally been taxed this year versus last year, and yet we talk about wind power. They're taxed because that comes out of the general fund that we're borrowing money from Chinese. That's reality. Wind and solar are fine as long as they're subsidized. As long as you pay for them, Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer, they're fine. But that's an additional tax on you. If it was so economical, so well to be done, then we would have done it a long time ago. And I say it will work. It's like ethanol, it works. It's still not economical. So we have to go back to what commerce is run by, and it's fossil fuels. We can have all those other forms of energy. I do not want them subsidized. We can have all those other forms of energy, but we have to have the ability to move product. I look at the Port of Seattle, the Port of Tacoma. Every one of those ships are burning a fossil fuel to deliver those goods. Every truck that leaves that port goes out to deliver those to the people around this nation is burning fossil fuels. Every train that leaves is burning fossil fuels. Every airplane that lands built by Boeing is burdened by fossil fuels. This is a chance for us to speak up in Congress and say we are going to develop our natural fuels in this country so we can compete legitimately. You cannot compete by borrowing money to buy foreign oil. And that's what that side wants to do. I'm saying that's wrong. And I will join hands with you if you vote for ANWR and you vote for, other forms of energy too. I'll join. Let's get it all together, guys. Let's have an energy plan. All we're trying to do here is undo what the Obama administration did. That's put a moratorium in. And I urge to defeat this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. All time having expired, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is
Mr. Chair,
not
on that, I would
agreed to.
request a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Washington requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in House Report 112-74 on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Amendment number 3 by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. And amendment number 4 by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts. The chair will reduce to 5 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 2, printed in House Report 112-74 by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House wraps up work, on amendments anyway, on a bill that would require the Interior Department to hold lease sales for drilling off the East Coast from Maine to North Carolina, off the coast of Southern California, the Arctic Ocean, and Alaska's Bristol Bay. They will vote on 3 of those amendments here. This first one, a 15-minute vote on an amendment proposed by Jerry Connolly, Bobby Scott, and Jim Moran of Virginia, which would clarify that new offshore drilling can't interfere with the operations of the armed forces. This will be a 15-minute vote, and 2 5-minute amendment votes will follow, and that ought to do it for recorded work. They will finish up work on this bill more than likely on Thursday in the U.S. House. Earlier today, the House did pass by a vote of 243 to 179 a bill that would speed up the process for approving offshore drilling. Ahead of that vote, we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter about this series of bills that the House has been working through on offshore drilling. From Politico, Darren Good joins us. The Republicans have been devoting a lot of efforts in getting these drilling measures passed in the U.S. House. What's behind that?
Well, I think this is certainly part of a big messaging war right now between Republicans and Democrats, both on Capitol Hill and also in the White House. Republicans have been pushing the idea that in order to lower gas prices, we need to increase domestic production of oil and gas and other energy sources. They were upset and went after the administration for the moratorium on deepwater oil and gas drilling following the Gulf of Mexico spill and the kind of the slow pace, especially initially, on getting permits out, drilling permits out, even once that 5-month federal ban was lifted. Democrats all over on the Senate side right now are going after oil companies for their profits right now. And they've got ideas specifically to bring down gas prices, but it's part of this, frankly, a lot of noise going on Capitol Hill about gas prices, and it's because there's a lot of concern back home when people are paying about $4 a gallon.
Well, is there evidence that any of the Republican bills proposed so far would actually reduce gas prices?
Well, no, well, it depends on who you ask. I mean, the fact is that gas prices are mainly set by global crude oil prices. And the fact is that, number one, it takes a while to produce a well. So if you were to greenlight gas, if these bills were to pass now, it would take probably at least a decade for production to start in the areas that these bills would open up, and that's not guaranteed. Number two, the U.S. doesn't put out a whole lot of oil and gas on the global market at this point, and it's unclear how much production would actually help. So it's one of those things where, well, it could help some, but frankly, I mean, these bills, and we can get into that argument, I suppose, but these bills aren't going to become law. Again, I think this is just part of a kind of messaging from Capitol Hill where both sides have their ideas. But, it's unclear how much of an impact this would have on prices. Again, it depends on who you would ask.
Well, in arguing about these the bills this week, the House Republicans were saying that this would reverse President Obama's moratorium on offshore oil exploration. Democrats saying there isn't a moratorium in place currently. What's the case?
Well, that's true. There is one there's one in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and that expires in 2022. It's true that off the coastlines there isn't right now. And also, I think it depends on which moratorium we're talking about. I mean, there was the 5-month federal deepwater ban after the Gulf spill, and that has been lifted. But I think what Republicans are referring to in this case, I think, are almost more of a symbolic moratorium where the administration doesn't seem likely to approve oil and gas drilling, for example, off the southern coast of California, which is what the third bill coming up today would do. And there are areas off the Atlantic coast, for example, that the administration likely is not going to greenlight drilling.
Well, looking into the U.S. Senate, you talked about this bill that would propose to repeal tax breaks for oil and gas companies. When is the Senate likely to take something like that up?
Well, they're supposed to be bringing up at some point to the floor this week, I think, to start debate. A vote probably wouldn't happen until next week sometime. That's not likely going to pass either. There are enough Republicans and Democrats representing quote-unquote oil states like Mary Landrieu in Louisiana, Mark Begich in Alaska, who don't like the idea of singling out these companies, singling out one industry, tax incentives for one industry. Probably, again, we'll see. I mean, Democrats are already doing press conferences and such talking about the bill that was introduced yesterday. Again, it would repeal about $21 billion in tax incentives for the 5 largest oil companies and use that money to pay down the debt or help lower the debt. It's been quote-unquote hotlined, which means it's ready for floor action whenever they decide to bring it up. They're doing some nominations so far this week, and so we could see some debate on that this week, but a vote wouldn't happen until next week.
Darren Good, keeping an eye on the drilling bills in the U.S. House and Senate. You can read his work at Politico.com. Thank you for the update.
Thank you.
And we recorded that conversation ahead of the vote on the bill that would speed up the process for permits for offshore drilling. The final vote on that, it was passed by the House by a vote of 243 to 179. Then they moved on to general debate on a bill that requires the Interior Department to hold lease sales for offshore drilling off the East Coast, off the Southern California coast, in the Pacific, in the Arctic, and also Bristol Bay in Alaska. As you heard in that conversation with Darrell Good, the Senate was, on Tuesday, the bill was introduced that would repeal $21 billion worth of tax breaks for some major oil companies. And Senator Reid has indicated that it's possible he'll open up the floor for debate this week and eyeing a vote possibly next week on that legislation. Well, earlier today in the U.S. Senate, Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, a Democrat, and Senator Mark Begich of Alaska, a Republican, a Democrat rather, also rose in opposition to that legislation by Senator Reid. Before we get to that, I just want to let you know that this is the first of 3 amendment votes here on the House floor, 3 amendments to the legislation opening up lease sales off the coast of the Pacific and Atlantic. But from earlier today in the U.S. Senate, here's Senators Landrieu and Begich, and they're talking about their opposition to the proposed $21 billion worth of ending the subsidies to oil companies.
I'd like to, Mr. President, be able to speak and get consent to speak as if in morning business.
The senator has that right until 2 o'clock, and then the Senate proceeds into executive session.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President, and to my friend who just spoke a little bit ago from Oklahoma, absolutely I'm aware of the quantity and the value of Alaska oil and gas, and today I rise to discuss this issue as well as a few others related to the issues of oil and gas. I rise today to discuss an issue foremost on the minds of my constituents and the concern to all Americans, the rising cost of energy. I want to outline the proposals aimed at providing short-term relief for high prices at the pump and to assure America's long-term energy security. These are the issues which have been discussed many times in these chambers. The time for talk is past. The time to act is now, Mr. President. High energy prices today already are pinching pocketbooks of families and crippling our small businesses across my state and across this country. When I was home over the recess, I visited the roaded areas of Alaska. These are communities connected by our highway and road system, from Kenai Peninsula to Fairbanks, where gas prices were well over $4 a gallon. As you can see by the poster next to me, they ranged from $4.15 a gallon to $4.35 a gallon. These prices might look good to some of my colleagues who saw gas prices over $5 a gallon in their home states, but off the road system in Alaska, prices are much, much higher. The fact is, prices for gasoline and home heating oil never came down in rural Alaska. They've been well over $5 a gallon for years. Some places, such as Anatovik Pass, are nearly $10 a gallon. I started a discussion with Alaskans on Facebook to just see how these high prices are affecting their budgets. Some families are already facing really tough choices to make their budgets balance. For families commuting into Anchorage from Mat-Su Valley every day, they are forced to pay more than $100 a week to fuel up. That's more than a pocketbook pinch, it's a punch. And even worse, families know the price isn't coming down anytime soon, and even though speculation ranges all over the place, prices are still expected to rise 30 to 40 cents, probably by July. And it's not just families, small businesses.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Orenda L. Wright Allen of Virginia to be United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Virginia.
Under the previous order, there will be 1 hour of debate with respect to the nomination, with the time equally divided in the usual form. The senator from Alaska is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 7 additional minutes, that the time be counted against the Democratic side, and that my speech in the congressional record not be split.
Without objection, so ordered.
And even worse, families know the price isn't coming down, as I mentioned. It's continuing to rise. And it's not just affecting families, it's affecting businesses. They feel the sticker shock also at the pump. We're seeing businesses through rising food and delivery prices to make up the difference. These families and businesses expect us to act now, no more excuses. Energy is one place where we should be able to find bipartisan common ground. I've been calling so close last spring, but now here we are again. We need to provide Americans reliable and affordable energy in 3 ways: short-term relief for consumers, new renewable energy sources for reliable electricity prices, and keep strong investment in alternative transportation systems, and increase domestic oil and gas production so we're not dependent on unfriendly foreign sources. First, the short term, which I call the pocketbook relief. We must help families keep their budgets balanced and help ensure that increasing consumer confidence doesn't falter. To that, I've introduced a family account to save on transportation, the FAST Act, to help families get through the high gas prices over the next 2 years. This bill will allow employers to set up pre-tax transportation savings account, just like medical savings accounts, to help offset the pain of high gas prices on the family pocketbook. The bill will sunset in 2 years, so it will have no long-term burden on the federal budget. Second, we have to bring online alternative power sources to buffer power companies from price shocks of rising oil and gas prices. No matter where you are in Alaska, you don't have to go far to find alternative energy sources: wind and tidal, geothermal and hydro. Even in these tough budget times, this is a good investment to strengthen our economy far into the future. The same is true for alternative transportation systems and fuels. We must fully support efforts to develop electric, hybrid, and highly efficient vehicles. At the same time, we must recognize most working families cannot afford to purchase a new vehicle. So we need to find other ways to reduce their transportation costs, such as greater investment into city-to-city commuter services. The recent investment in high-speed rail is positive, but is not reaching most of the country and will not. Even in Alaska, we have the potential for commuter rail. It is critical to move commuters from city to city and cutting the $100 a week gas prices that our folks from Matsu pay as they drive into Anchorage for employment. Solving our energy security challenge cannot just focus on reducing consumption. Yes, it's important, but we must cut the use, as is identified through consumption, that we need to reduce fossil fuels in all sectors, especially transportation. But we also need to increase our domestic production. Every new oil and gas development buys our country more energy security and national security, while also creating American jobs. Unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. 30 years ago, 28% of our oil was imported. Today, 60%. And while our largest share of oil imports come from Canada, too much is coming from unstable countries or those openly hostile to the United States. Not only will we become increasingly dependent on these countries for our oil, but we are exporting over $1 billion a day. Let me repeat that, $1 billion a day we export. In my home state, Alaska, we have vast potential to increase America's energy security. The fact is, developing Alaska's oil and gas resources buys our country decades of energy security by offsetting foreign imports from unfriendly countries. Consider a few examples, which I have here on the board next to me. Developing offshore resources in the Chukchi, up in this area, in the Beaufort Sea, will produce 1.8 million barrels of oil a day. This is easily enough to offset oil imports from Saudi Arabia. You could even cover Iraq, too. Developing the oil beneath the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, could offset imports from Nigeria. Developing the CD5 project in the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska. Let me repeat that again. The National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, set up for petroleum products and production. And BP's Liberty project could replace daily imports from Libya. This does not even include the tremendous on- and offshore natural gas resources we have in Alaska. 1/3 of the country's supply in Alaska. So why aren't we developing these enormous resources in my state? 2 words: politics and bureaucrats. Mr. President, earlier this year, President Obama went to Brazil, where he declared that America wants to be a customer for Brazilian oil and natural gas. I got to say, you don't need to go too far. You don't need to go to Brazil to do that. You can do it right here in Alaska with our people, our resources, our opportunities. I remind the President of that, and I'll remind him on a regular basis. To his credit, I will say later in the month, he did mention Alaska. Alaska, in his call for energy and domestic energy independence, he mentioned Alaska. Unfortunately, the bureaucrats in his administration are not listening. They are not. They are tossing up barriers in additional Alaskan oil and gas production every chance they get. Sadly, some of my colleagues in this body are not much better. Instead of addressing the problem with specific solutions, they are going for headlines by dragging energy company executives before committees or promising the roadblock or proposing that roadblock incentives for increased domestic energy production, some of which have been on the books for decades. Let's stop the headline grabbing and get serious about the energy security. I have 3 ideas. First, better coordinate the federal offshore permitting process. I introduced legislation before recess to create the Arctic OCS coordinated model after legislation that late Senator Ted Stevens passed, establishing the Federal Gas Pipeline Coordinator. My bill addresses the problem too many projects are caught in. What I call the...
Senator, currently used 7 minutes.
I'd ask for an additional 3 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
My bill addresses the problem too many projects are caught in, what I call the regulatory whack-a-mole. You think you have smack down one regulatory hurdle and another one pops up. This bill gives authority to work across the agencies causing companies so much heartburn today. The EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, Interior Department, just to name a few. Second, let's align the clean air standards for offshore drilling permits among the affected federal agencies. We must have a level playing field whether you are in Alaska or the Gulf of Mexico or the eastern United States. As my colleague from Louisiana knows, who's here joining on the floor, Louisiana has one rule, Alaska has another rule for the same issue. Third, let's invest in American transportation and safety infrastructure to develop oil and gas resources in frontier areas. The fact is we need a far greater Coast Guard presence in the Arctic for oil spill prevention and response. We also need to invest in our pipeline infrastructure, including the Alaska Natural Gas Line, to move oil and gas resources from the Arctic to other U.S. regions. There's a lot of talk right now about ending tax incentives for oil and gas industry. With the high profits right now, these companies are easy targets. But one thing Alaskans know, just because you have an easy target doesn't mean it's the right thing to shoot. It won't decrease gas prices at the pump for our families and our small businesses. It will discourage companies, especially the independents, from domestic investment and job creation. As someone who represents a state with the highest energy prices in the country and some of the best renewable and traditional energy resources, I'm ready to join my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address America's energy needs now. But we need to set a hard target. That is why I'm asking my colleagues to get serious about real energy plan and give Americans freedom from high gas prices by the 4th of July. Let's work together, roll up our sleeves, and pass a real comprehensive energy plan our families and our small businesses can get behind. And let's finally invest in our future energy and put the reforms in place to ensure long-term energy security. Mr. President, I recognize my colleague from Louisiana, another great state of oil and gas development. He's here on the floor with me, and I yield the floor at this time.
Mr. President. The senator from Louisiana.
I thank my colleague from Alaska for asking me to join him in a general presentation and potentially a colloquy between the two of us about the importance of continuing our support for oil and gas production here in the United States by the large international companies that have operated in our country and around the world now for many years, as well as by the hundreds, if not thousands, of independents that operate doing the same. There's going to be a bill that's going to be debated in the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow. It's S-940, sponsored by the senator from New Jersey, our colleague, Senator Menendez, that I want to go on record in strongly opposing. And I'm going to give some reasons why, and would urge my colleagues, when this bill comes up, which I understand it will, directly to the floor of the Senate without being heard traditionally in the committee, that we would vote it down. I doubt that the bill in its current form, or in any form that it could be modified, could get the 60 votes necessary for passage, but I would just like to add my strong voice to urging my colleagues to read this bill, to look at it and understand the inherent unfairness in it, the lack of significant deficit reduction, and the fact that it will not, although it's being touted as, it will not reduce gasoline prices by 1 penny. I want to start with just some facts that people might find very interesting or hard to believe based on the political rhetoric that they've been hearing from the sponsors of this bill and others in the Senate. It goes sort of, the storyline is, big oil operates, they make huge profits at the expense of everyone, they pay virtually nothing in taxes, and we subsidize them. Why are we doing this? Why don't we stop? So I think that it would be good to just get a few things clarified for the record. It may be surprising to American taxpayers to know that of the $16.6 billion spent on U.S. energy subsidies over the course of 1 year, that oil and gas subsidies account for less than 13%. I want to say that again. Of the $16.6 billion spent on U.S. energy subsidies over the course of 1 year, fuels such as renewables, refined coal, nuclear, solar, hydro, etc., account for 85%. Oil and gas is less than 15%, actually 13%. You would think, because of this bill, S-940, that the big oil and gas companies are getting all the subsidies, making all the profits, paying no taxes, and the rest of us are suffering. Nothing could be further from the truth. Let me repeat, this bill, 940, is going to repeal virtually all subsidies from one industry and one sector of one industry, oil and gas companies. But, Mr. President, they only get 13% of all the energy subsidies. Why aren't we talking about the other 85%? Some of them, in some people's minds, create some harm to the environment, whether it be dams blocking up rivers so fisheries are extinct, or whether it's coal that has its own issues. Of course, nuclear doesn't have any problems. We don't, we must not be paying attention to what's happening in Japan.
On this vote,
singling out one sector of
this vote, the yeas are 193, the nays are 228. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 3, printed in House Report 112-74 by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
And this is the Second Amendment vote to a bill that would require the Interior Department to hold lease sales for drilling off the East Coast, the Southern Pacific, or coast of Southern California, and the Arctic as well. This is an amendment that was proposed by Representative Markey of Massachusetts, a 5-minute vote. Earlier today, the House passed a bill that will speed up the process, proposes to speed up the process for approving offshore drilling permits, and that passed by a vote of 243 to 179. And the Senate will soon see action on a bill that proposes to end $21 billion in tax breaks to major oil companies. We showed you some of the comments of Mark Begich of Alaska, and we're showing you Mary Landrieu from earlier today on the Senate floor. And we'll see a bit more of that now as this 5-minute vote continues.
One part of the energy industry to repeal the subsidies when it will, in fact, have the opposite effect of reducing gasoline prices, which even its sponsors, one of its co-sponsors, said publicly for us not to be fooled. This will not reduce gasoline prices. So why are we doing it? Will it create jobs? No. It will actually hurt job production in the United States. According to the EIA study, which is the United States government, not a company, published in 2008, the oil and natural gas industry received 13% of the subsidies while producing 60% of the energy. Let me repeat. This industry got only 13% of the subsidies but produced 60% of the energy. But the sponsors of this bill, S940, that's going to be debated in the Finance Committee, where the industry leaders are going to be called to talk about this gimmick, 940, produce with their independent counterparts 60% of the energy. And I'd like to say where exactly that energy comes from, because it really is a bone of contention. The Senator of Alaska will appreciate this, that the sponsor of this bill represents a state that is one of the highest deficit energy producing states in the nation, because some of us do this better than others. Louisiana produces a lot of energy. Alaska produces a lot of energy. Texas produces a lot of energy. Some states like to consume a lot and produce nothing. That would be like some of our states that put some of their land in agriculture so that they can produce food. Other states saying, we don't want to produce food, but we expect you to provide it to us. Provide it to us when we want it, how we want it, and for the price we want it. And I'm tired of it. And so are the people that I represent. So I want to put this deficit chart up here. We've seen a lot of deficit charts about deficits of infrastructure, real deficits of money, debt. Let me talk to you about the deficit and the debt owed by some states in this union that consume a lot, talk a lot, and produce nothing. California has the greatest deficit. It consumes a tremendous amount of energy, and the imbalance is the highest. It produces the least, consumes the most. Now, to California's benefit, before Senator Feinstein and Boxer run down here to argue this point, I want to concede this one point. California has been on the forefront of energy conservation and efficiency. This chart does not recognize them for that, but I will concede that point, and I'm going to have some further data to explain that. California, while it doesn't produce a lot of energy, it consumes a tremendous amount. At least California has been in the forefront of savings and efficiency, because there are a lot of states up here that don't produce, don't conserve, aren't efficient, and all they want to do is yell about high gas prices. Why don't you do something about it? Florida is a perfect example. Florida has a net deficit in BTUs of 3 I guess it's $3,889,000,000. Florida is a great example. I don't think Florida does much in nuclear. I don't think they do much in hydro. They have a lot of sun. I don't know how much solar they're doing. They will not let anybody produce oil and gas on or off their shores, but they sure fill up a lot of their gas tanks every day. They sure fire up those hotels and those restaurants with that energy. And where do they get their energy from? This is going to be, if it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable. They have a gas line that goes from Mobile, Alabama, to the Florida Peninsula. We pump the gas out of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, put it in a pipeline, and ship it under the Gulf of Mexico so they can light up their state. Would they ever think of putting an oil and gas well? Or build a nuclear power plant? Or if they can't do that, then why don't you conserve your energy? New York is another user of energy which produces very little. Ohio, Georgia, New Jersey, North Carolina, Michigan, and Illinois. Now, to some of these states, like New Jersey and Michigan, think about what they look like. They are big, they have big factories, they have big industries. Michigan is the home to the automobile industry, so they use a lot of gas in producing things that we all use. So we want to give them credit for that. But still, the fact remains that Michigan uses a lot more energy than it produces. And then you get down here to what I call, you know, the gold star states. We get criticized so much, we're treated like we're some sort of pariahs sometimes, but I think we do a great job. Kentucky, Alaska, New Mexico, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Wyoming. And Alaska is up here somewhere. No, Alaska's right here. Kentucky, Alaska, New Mexico, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Wyoming. We produce enough energy for everybody in our state, what we need, and we export it to everyone else in America that needs it. And what do we get?
On this vote, the yeas are 189, the nays are 238. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 4, printed in House Report 112-74 by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
And this will be the last recorded vote of the day in the U.S. House. An amendment proposed by Congressman Keating of Massachusetts to a bill that would require the Interior Department to hold lease sales off the East Coast from Maine to North Carolina for offshore drilling off the coast of Southern California, in the Arctic Ocean, and in Alaska's Bristol Bay. 5-minute vote on the House floor. Earlier today, they passed another offshore drilling bill, and that passed by a vote of 243 to 179, a bill that would speed up the process for approving those offshore permits. In some political news today, former U.S. House Speaker Newt Gingrich announced that he plans to run for president. He made his announcement via Twitter, saying today, "I'm announcing my candidacy for president of the United States." We have linked to that tweet and to his video announcement on our website at cspan.org. Also linked to the speech by Donald Trump from earlier today in New Hampshire. I want to let you know, too, that Newt Gingrich will be in Macon, Georgia on Friday, and he will have live coverage of that for you. His comments at the Georgia Republican Party Convention Friday at 7:15 Eastern here on C-SPAN. Well, while we wait for this while we watch this vote continue, we're going to take you back to the U.S. Senate earlier today. Mary Landrieu and her opposition to the Democratic bill that would end $21 billion in tax breaks to oil companies.
That go after directly the big companies in our state that work in our state to somehow put them in a position to make them feel like they're not really good companies, they're not American companies, they don't pay tax, they get all these subsidies. I'm going to read into the record what taxes they pay. It's going to surprise you. And then on top of that, we get moratoriums. We get permatoriums. We can't even drill for the oil we have. We can't even look for the oil we might have. And my people, when I go home, ask me, and it's a very hard thing for me to answer, and maybe Senator Bagich, they might ask you the same. They say to me, Senator, since we do so much to produce energy for the country, why do we pay $4 a gallon for gasoline? And sometimes we pay a little bit more than everybody else. They don't produce anything, Senator. Why do we pay so much? Can you tell me what you answer your people? Because I don't know what to tell them. Other than this place is a little screwed up. So until I get an answer for that, and I'll ask the Senator, go ahead, what do you tell them? Because I really don't know.
It's a hard one to answer because they see the oil flowing. They see, as I mentioned, we have $10 a gallon gas in some of our communities. $10 a gallon. And so it's hard to explain that, yeah, we're the big producer, but the rest of the country then picks on us. And I'm just listening and unbelievable, the green slice you have.
Green slide. And I'll say to the Senator, because he raises an excellent point, President Obama is not the first president to go overseas and ask for them to produce more oil to send it to us. This goes on. President Clinton did it. President Bush did it. We go beg Saudi Arabia to produce more energy. We ask OPEC to please don't tighten it so much so our prices. Why don't you go to the local OPEC or the local producers, which are Kentucky, Alaska, New Mexico, Louisiana, West Virginia, and Wyoming? Why don't you help us produce more? Because we can do it. But we get shut down by bureaucracy, moratoriums, permatorium, rules, regulations, EPA, refuges. We can't even get free to produce the energy that we can produce for this country. And then you've got all these middle states that, do a fairly good job of balance. But I tell you, if we passed a law in here that said every state in America had to produce the energy that it needed, we'd have an energy policy, all right. Mark, Senator Begich knows, I don't know what it would be, but it would be an interesting rule, just like in the old days. If you wanted food, you produced it. It would be a great law. Every state in America, all 50, if you consume energy, you need to produce something. You can produce it by wind. You could produce it by hydro. You could produce it by nuclear. You could stop driving all your automobiles and everybody walk. You could give everybody a bicycle. We don't care. Just eliminate the energy deficit. That would be a very interesting discussion to have. And I might even file a bill like that because this one is so ridiculous, people might actually read the one I would file. Now let me give you a couple of other stats, and then I know that I'm exceeding my time. I want to ask for 2 more minutes. I want to put to rest this issue that the big oil companies don't pay any taxes. This is from Forbes magazine, so take it as it is. It's slanted towards industry. I give you that. It's not it's not left to center. It's right to center, sometimes very right. But I think you can check these figures with anybody else. I'm assuming they're accurate. ExxonMobil, this is for the top 20 most profitable U.S. corporations in 2010. ExxonMobil's net income was $30 billion. Their tax rate was not 10%, not 15%, not 25%, not 35%, 45% tax rate. Their estimated worldwide tax bill was $90 billion. $90 billion. Of $10 billion in total taxes paid in the United States, $3 billion was income tax. Okay, let's go on. ConocoPhillips. Their tax rate was 42%.
On this vote, the yeas are 180.
Mr. Landry. Mr. Landry votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 186, the nays are 240. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the...
I move that the committee do now rise.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion to rise. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 1231, directed me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration H.R. 1231 and has come to no resolution thereon. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. The Chair is prepared to entertain 1-minute request. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, they are America's angels abroad. They are ambassadors for America, and they are good folks that represent everything that is right about our country. They are the Peace Corps volunteers, and this is the 50th year of the Peace Corps. These are the most wonderful people I think I've ever met. But there's a problem in the Peace Corps, because many times these volunteers go overseas, they help out other countries, but they become victims of crime and victims of sexual assault. In fact, in 2009, there were 122 of them that were victims of sexual assault by predators in foreign countries. And the problem is there's not much compassion, not much concern, and not much care with the Peace Corps about the plight of these victims, according to the victims who testified today. But those things are changing. Director Williams is committed to making the Peace Corps a safe place for our volunteers overseas. We're going to work with him and these victims to promote legislation so that we will have a protocol that is the law, so that they are treated perfectly, they are treated better. You know, we are the greatest human rights nation in the world. We promote human rights, but human rights need to also apply to victims in the Peace Corps who are sexually assaulted overseas. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to our nation's law enforcement officers, the brave men and women who dedicate their lives to protecting our communities. This week is National Police Week, and thousands of officers from across the country will gather here in Washington to pay tribute to those who have fallen in the line of duty. Sadly, in the past year, 162 officers have died in the line of duty, including 2 from Minnesota, Sergeant Joseph Bergeron of Maplewood and Monoma County Sheriff's Deputy Chris Dewey. As we remember these officers, Mr. Speaker, I want to call attention to legislation that I have introduced that would help protect those who protect us. H.R. 1789, the State and Local Law Enforcement Discipline, Accountability, and Due Process Act, would guarantee law enforcement officers have basic rights during disciplinary actions. I ask and urge my colleagues to sign on to this legislation so we can also help and protect our law enforcement officers. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Speak for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine in your household if for every $1 you spent, 40 cents was borrowed? That's the situation we're in with every dollar that we spend in the U.S. Congress today. And yet there are those who do not want to reform or change. But if I brought in my family and said, listen, guys, for every dollar we spend, 40 cents is borrowed, we would say, okay, what can we cut out? Can we do with less travel? Can we do with less clothes? Can we cut back on the kitchen table a little bit? We would come up with some ideas. They might be tough choices, but it's the right thing to do. It is time for Congress to get our house in order and to think about the next generation, not just the next election. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I can tell you each and every day people come to see me to ask for more money to be spent. We've got to change our culture of spending here and get the House under control. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
Address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise tonight to recognize our men and women in uniform and join our community in celebrating National Military Appreciation Month. The month of May encompasses a number of celebratory days linked to our armed forces, their families, and our nation's proud history. From Military Spouse Appreciation Day to Victory in Europe Day, and from Loyalty Day to Armed Forces Day and Memorial Day, the month of May is a time for our nation to come together and give praise to our most heroic citizens. Our nation traditionally recognizes our troops' sacrifice in a somber manner on Memorial Day. But National Military Appreciation Month allows us to not only appreciate those who have given their lives for our freedom, but also to celebrate the resolve of our nation through its most difficult times. I welcome our nation to join in recognizing the contribution of our servicemen and women, past and present, for all that they have done to preserve our freedom and our way of life. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I noted with interest that the President announced this week he was going to give a major address on immigration. As one who's been involved in this issue for 3 decades, I was very interested to find out the approach the President was going to take. So let me register my disappointment at the demonization of those who might have a disagreement with the President that was expressed by him in his speech yesterday. Talking about moats and talking about alligators and talking about intransigence on the other side of the aisle is not the way to attract bipartisan support to deal with one of the most difficult and important questions of our nation. I wouldn't say I'm outraged. I would say I'm disappointed at the tone those remarks of the President yesterday. If, in fact, we're going to work together on issues as important as that, it would seem to me to be important for us to, in some way, at least accept the fact that there may be legitimate reason for differences and try and bridge those differences rather than expand them.
Are there any further requests for 1 minute? Okay. Hearing none, the Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas for Tuesday, May 10th.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Western Caucus has several members here tonight. We would like to talk about what is going on right now in the country. The administration seems to be waging a war on the Western jobs, and that is carried out through a whole range of activities. A couple of weeks ago, the President said that the administration is not doing enough to address the high gas prices. The President said in his speech at Georgetown that he would like to cut foreign oil by 1/3 by drilling at home. Well, we have been in the process of offering him the solution to what he said he would like to do. Now, keep in mind that while the President is saying one thing, he's doing another. While he says that we would like to drill for more oil here, understand that he has increased the moratorium on the offshore drilling. They've made it more difficult to drill in on-land areas through the Rocky Mountains. Know that they rejected Shell Oil Company's $4 billion NEPA study because a paragraph was omitted. So while we're hearing bold language from this administration about increasing the amount of oil that we're drilling here at home, and that would create American jobs, but it would also create lower energy prices, understand that it appears that the President is not following through on what he said. So in the past couple of days, this Congress, this House, has passed out H.R. 1229, which says that we're going to put the people back to work in the Gulf of Mexico. I think everyone understands that BP is accountable and should be accountable for the problems that they caused. But we should not have killed 100,000 jobs offshore. Our nation is stuck at 9% unemployment. We're stuck with a deficit that is having to be financed by our own Federal Reserve. We're putting the nation's economy at risk because of the way that we're treating jobs and because of our deficit. So we're saying put the American workers back to work in the Gulf, produce American oil, produce American jobs, and bring lower prices of gasoline to the consumer. The same bill improves the safety by reforming current law. It sets timelines for the Secretary to act on permits to drill. Right now, one of the things that the Secretary is doing is holding off approvals for those applications for permits to drill the APDs. Know that the administration has within its power to improve the situation with jobs immediately, but instead they're doing the things that harm our work. H.R. 1229 also establishes expedited judicial review processes. We also have passed in this House H.R. 1230, which says we're going to restart American Offshore Leasing Now Act. It passed last week. It requires that the 4 lease sales in the Gulf and Virginia take place. Those lease sales were previously scheduled, but instead of going ahead with them, the administration has put them on hold. Let's simply produce the energy which has been verified to be there, which would create American jobs, and which would aid American consumers by lower prices of gasoline. H.R. 1231 has also been passed, which reverses President Obama's offshore moratorium. The President made a big deal just after he was sworn in 2 years ago about reversing the moratorium. But after one analyzed the moratorium that he reversed, we actually saw that he increased the moratorium, that more areas were put off limits to drilling rather than the message that he gave the American people. So H.R. 1231 says to the President that we would like for you to join us in creating American jobs, jobs that the West would be proud of, jobs that would produce energy, jobs that would produce high-paying careers, not just jobs. We believe that these are the things that the American people are looking for. This is the leadership that they're asking for out of Washington. H.R. 1231 requires each 5-year offshore leasing plan to include lease sales in areas containing the greatest known oil and natural gas reserves. Our offshore areas are tremendous reserves of energy. All we have to do is tap into them and use them. It requires the Secretary establish a production goal when writing the 5-year plan. I'm joined tonight by several members of the Western Caucus. Each one has got their own particular interest area. where the administration appears to be conducting a war on Western jobs. So tonight, to lead off, I would like to yield time to my good friend Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming, and I would yield as much time as she would consume.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman from New Mexico for yielding. I appreciate his leadership of the Western Caucus and look forward to this robust discussion tonight.